From New York, this is Democracy Now! President Trump returns to the campaign trail for the first time after his COVID-19 hospitalization, despite doctors refusing to confirm he's had a negative test. We'll look at how his defiant actions over the past week have threatened the health of the White House residence staff, a majority of whom are older people of color. 3 housekeepers and 1 other member of the staff were recently infected. We'll speak to Charles Allen. His late father served as a butler for 8 presidents and was portrayed in Lee Daniels' film, The Butler.
I would tell him, I said, Dad, you got to get out. You have to get out. And I would tell that to him, and I would tell that to my Uncle Johnny, who also worked in the house.
Plus, we'll look at the pandemic dangers domestic workers face across the country. Longtime domestic workers advocate Ai-jen Poo. Then, as we mark Indigenous Peoples Day, we look at the ongoing Indigenous-led protests against President Trump's border wall in southern Arizona.
Indigenous Peoples Day is every day, and we're here to celebrate our heritage, celebrate the fact that we are still here despite not being recognized as still here, and our traditional homeland still exists, are crossed by the border wall, and we will be here beyond when the wall is taken down, and we will be here to fight the border wall and its ongoing encroachment against and between our people.
We'll speak to Nellie Jo David, an Odom water and land defender. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Trump's resumed public events less than 1 week after he left Walter Reed Hospital, where he was treated for COVID-19. Trump has repeatedly declared himself immune to COVID-19 in recent days, has also said he can't spread the disease with no evidence.
I beat this crazy horrible China virus, and it also gives you immunity. I mean, it does give you immunity. Even the people that just cannot accept anything, I mean, they just don't want to accept anything. No, so I passed the highest test.
Trump's doctors are refusing to disclose whether he is now COVID negative or when he last tested negative for the coronavirus before he was hospitalized. On Saturday, Trump held a small campaign rally on the South Lawn of the White House where he spoke unmasked from the balcony to a group of hundreds, which included many Black and Latinx supporters. ABC News reports conservative activist Candace Owens paid travel and lodging costs for the members of her so-called Blexit group to attend Saturday's rally. Trump is scheduled to appear at a rally in the Orlando Sanford International Airport in Florida today, and his campaign is planning large rallies in Pennsylvania and Iowa later in the week. This comes as Minnesota's Department of Health identified 9 cases of COVID-19 stemming from Trump's rally in Bemidji, Minnesota last month, including 1 person who was hospitalized in an intensive care unit. Ahead of Trump's release from Walter Reed last week, the New York Times reports the president proposed an idea to his aides for a stunt. Trump would walk past photographers appearing frail and weak, only to rip open his button-down shirt, revealing a Superman T-shirt underneath. On Friday, House Speaker Nancy Pelosi introduced a bill that would create a congressional panel to judge the president's capacity to carry out the job, invoking the 25th Amendment, which lays out the line of presidential succession. Meanwhile, top U.S. infectious disease scientist Dr. Anthony Fauci is disavowing a Trump campaign commercial that he says took his words out of context. The ad features these remarks selectively edited from an interview Fauci gave back in March.
I can't imagine that anybody could be doing more.
Dr. Fauci has never endorsed a political candidate in more than 35 years of public service. In a statement, he responded, quote, "The use of my name and my words by the GOP campaign was done without my permission, and the actual words themselves were taken out of context based on something I said months ago regarding the entire effort of the task force," unquote. U.S. coronavirus cases and hospitalizations continue to rise as the overall caseload has now topped 7.7 million, with a death toll of nearly 215,000. New cases hit a 2-month daily high Friday, with 10 states reporting record single-day rises, according to Reuters. In 31 states, new cases have gone up compared to the previous week. The New York Times reports the White House last month blocked an order from the Center for Disease Control and Prevention requiring face masks on all forms of public and commercial transportation across the United States. Meanwhile, Kentucky Governor Andy Beshear and his family will quarantine after a member of his security team tested positive for COVID-19. On Capitol Hill, stimulus talks remain stalled, with both Democrats and Republicans rejecting a White House proposal for a $1.8 trillion stimulus. Last Tuesday, Trump tweeted he was ending stimulus negotiations until after Election Day, only to reverse that announcement later in the day. Democrats say the latest White House offer is insufficient, citing shortfalls in funding for unemployment benefits, child care, and aid to state and local governments. Republicans say the bill is too costly and object to its expansion of the Affordable Care Act. Confirmation hearings for Supreme Court nominee Amy Coney Barrett begin in the Senate today. In her pre-released opening statement, Judge Barrett pledges to apply the law as written. However, more evidence has emerged that Barrett has publicly advocated against abortion rights, including supporting a reversal of Roe v. Wade. On Friday, Barrett amended her Senate questionnaire to include information about talks she gave in 2013 while she was a law professor at the University of Notre Dame, the talks hosted by an anti-abortion student groups. She also disclosed she signed a newspaper advertisement in 2006 that called for, quote, an end to the barbaric legacy of Roe versus Wade, unquote. The second presidential debate, which had been scheduled for this Thursday, has been canceled after Trump refused to take part in a virtual debate despite his recent COVID-19 diagnosis. Joe Biden will instead participate in an ABC News town hall on that date. The next and final presidential debate is scheduled for next Thursday, October 22nd. Meanwhile, in South Carolina, the planned debate between Senator Lindsey Graham and Democratic challenger Jamie Harrison was replaced Friday by separate individual interviews after Harrison insisted Graham take a coronavirus test before the debate, but Graham refused. Graham chairs the Senate Judiciary Committee, which is opening confirmation hearings for Judge Amy Coney Barrett today. This is Jamie Harrison speaking about health care in South Carolina at Friday's what became a candidate forum.
I remember just hearing about the coronavirus and cringing because I knew the impact that it would have here in South Carolina, particularly on the most vulnerable communities. We live in a state where almost 250,000 people don't have access to health care because we're one of 12 states that have refused to expand Medicaid. 38 other states have expanded Medicaid under the Affordable Care Act, and South Carolina has failed to do so. And as a result, 4 of our rural hospitals in this state have closed.
In other election news, in Pennsylvania, a federal judge has rejected a Trump campaign lawsuit that sought to remove ballot drop boxes in the state, saying there was no evidence that drop boxes would lead to voter fraud. The court also rejected several other voter suppression attempts by the Trump campaign, including an effort to require signature matching for mail-in ballots. Meanwhile, in Texas, the fate of a directive by Governor Greg Abbott limiting ballot drop boxes to 1 per county remains unknown after a court stayed a ruling by a judge Friday blocking Abbott's move. Voting rights advocates say limiting ballot drop boxes will not only decrease voting, it also puts people at increased risk during the pandemic. In international news, Azerbaijan has launched fresh air raids on the capital of the disputed territory of Nagorno-Karabakh as a Russia-backed ceasefire between Azeri and Armenian forces broke down less than a day after it was implemented Friday. Armenia accused Azerbaijan of deliberately targeting a historic cathedral. Meanwhile, Azerbaijan accused Armenia of shelling a residential area in its second-largest city, Ganja. At least 300 people have been killed since fighting in the territory erupted 2 weeks ago. In Nigeria, a controversial police unit has been abolished in response to mass protests calling for an end to the Special Anti-Robbery Squad, or SARS. Recent videos posted on social media show SARS officers, who are usually unidentified and in plain clothes, brutalizing people, including some cases apparently killing them. Activists warn, however, that simply reassigning violent officers will not solve the issue of police brutality. In Iraq, armed groups backed by Iran have agreed to a conditional ceasefire and attacks on U.S. targets, provided the Iraqi government present a timetable for U.S. troop withdrawal. Last month, the Trump administration threatened to shut down the U.S. embassy in Baghdad after a series of attacks on U.S.-linked targets. Back in the United States, a New York Times investigation into Donald Trump's tax history suggests Trump may have used part of a $30 million loan from City National Bank in Los Angeles to prop up his dwindling campaign funding in the weeks before the 2016 election. Trump's tax records show over $21 million in unusual payments from a Las Vegas hotel he co-owned that flowed through other Trump companies, which Trump may have then used to self-finance his campaign. Such funds would likely constitute illegal campaign contributions. Additionally, it would be illegal for Trump to claim a tax deduction on payments that were not actual business expenses. In related news, New York Attorney General Letitia James is investigating whether the Trump Organization inflated the value of a Westchester County property in order to reap a $21 million tax break as part of a conservation easement after Trump agreed to preserve 150 acres of woodlands on the estate. A federal appeals court ruled Friday President Trump's use of emergency powers in 2019 to divert billions of dollars from military construction funds to build the U.S.-Mexico border wall is illegal. We'll have more on Trump's border wall later in the broadcast as we head to Arizona to speak with Odom Water and Land Defender Nellie Jo David on Indigenous Peoples Day, where scores of cities and states are observing today after rejecting the celebration of Columbus Day. In immigration news, 2 Cameroonian asylum seekers who fear they were unknowingly subjected to forced sterilizations at Irwin Detention Center in Georgia are scheduled to be deported Tuesday. The women are now imprisoned at Montgomery Processing Center in Conroe, Texas. Advocates are demanding Immigration and Customs Enforcement release them on humanitarian grounds. Hurricane Delta has killed at least one person, cut power for hundreds of thousands, left towns underwater as it pummeled Louisiana just 6 weeks after Hurricane Laura ripped through the same region. Delta is the 10th Atlantic storm to hit the mainland this season. And rapper and activist Killer Mike announced he's launching a black-owned digital bank, Greenwood, along with Bounce TV founder Ryan Glover and former Atlanta Mayor Andrew Young. The online bank will provide financial services to Black and Latinx customers and is named after the former Greenwood neighborhood of Tulsa, Oklahoma, known as Black Wall Street, which was burned to the ground by a white mob in 1921. Killer Mike says Greenwood Bank, which will open in January, received tens of thousands of account requests within one day of its announcement. This is Andrew Young speaking with Killer Mike about wealth inequality.
We've got to put capital at the bottom of the pyramid so that whoever else has brilliant ideas that will make life better for everybody can develop those ideas.
And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. How many of your staff are sick? Do you think you might be a super spreader, Mr. President? Those were the questions a reporter shouted at President Trump as he left Walter Reed Hospital last week after being hospitalized for 3 nights with COVID-19. Trump ignored the questions, then flew to the White House, where he marched up to the balcony. In a reality-style wave, he saluted, took off his mask, appeared out of breath, then went inside, unmasked. Trump's defiant mask removal threatened the household staff, a majority of whom are older people of color. Little attention has been paid in the media to how the COVID-19 pandemic has impacted the health of domestic workers, not only at the White House, but across the world. The New York Times reports 3 White House housekeepers and 1 other member of the residence staff were recently infected. The Times reports the workers were told to use, quote, discretion in discussing their infection. Public health experts have expressed alarm as Trump has repeatedly threatened the health of staff around him over the past week, from leaving the hospital while still being medicated, to returning to the Oval Office while still infected, to holding a rally on the White House grounds on Saturday that was not socially distanced. Later in the program, we'll be joined by Charles Allen. His father, Eugene Allen, was portrayed in Lee Daniels' film The Butler for his work serving 8 presidents from Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan. But first, we speak to Ai-jen Poo, senior advisor to Care in Action, which is dedicated to fighting for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers in the United States. It's the 501c4 arm of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. Ai-jen Poo, welcome back to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us. As we watch that defiant act of President Trump, where he took off his mask, turned around, and walked into the White House, we know that scores of resident staff are older African Americans and Latinx workers. Can you talk about your response and what it signifies to you?
Look, thank you for having me, Amy. I think we and domestic workers all over this country were watching with horror as we saw the recklessness with which the president was treating his household staff. I mean, these are essential workers who have been keeping him and his family safe and caring for them, and he showed a complete and utter disregard for their health and safety in this context. And it is, in many ways, the tip of the spear to how he's been treating essential workers writ large. I mean, here we are 7 months into this pandemic and still no essential workers bill of rights, still no hazard pay, right? And here are in his house, right? Domestic work is all about, it really is a question of power here. When your workplace is someone else's home, there's an incredible imbalance of power and a tremendous amount of fear that domestic workers have in asserting their rights and advocating for themselves out of fear of losing their jobs and their livelihood. Now, there could be no other house in this country where the imbalance of power is more severe than that between the President of the United States and his housekeeping staff, and I think he's been abusing that power.
How do we find out who has been infected? We know that about 36 of his professional staff have been infected. They're high-profile people like the press secretary, almost the whole White House, media staff has been. And then a number of journalists who are covering the White House have been affected, at least 4 or 5. We know his top senior advisor, Stephen Miller. We know the names of all these people. But right before the White House press secretary, Kayleigh McEnany, herself said she tested positive. I believe that was last Monday. On Sunday, she told reporters at the White House she would no longer be revealing the number or names of people at the White House who tested positive. Now, it's even harder to find out about those on the resident staff.
Absolutely. There's 90 housekeeping staff, as far as we know, in the White House who are charged every day with maintaining the order and the sanity and the safety of the White House itself for the people who live there. And, this entire industry is really defined by its invisibility. People are working behind closed doors. And their work isn't even seen as real work. It's still referred to as help, right? After so many generations where we understand that this work is essential. And it's work that's disproportionately done by women and people of color, women of color, Black and brown women in particular. And so all of those factors contribute to the invisibility and the dehumanization of this workforce, which is why it's so important that we're vigilant about finding out about the health and the safety and the well-being of those workers in this time. We need transparency, and even more than that, we need protections for these workers.
We're going to break, and when we come back, we'll also be joined by the son of a man who worked in the White House for over for 8 presidents. He was the subject of Lee Daniels' film, The Butler. We're speaking to Ai-jen Poo, Senior Advisor to Care and Action, dedicated to fighting for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers in the United States. She's staying with us as well. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, the Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. Our guest is Ai-jen Poo, Senior Advisor to Care and Action, which is dedicated to fighting for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers in the United States, the 501c4 arm of the National Domestic Workers Alliance, of which Ai-jen Poo is Executive Director. If you can talk a little more nationally about the kind of dangers that people face who are in the most intimate jobs, many of them essential workers, but who are on the front lines, in many cases caring for people with COVID, and the kind of protections they have. For example, domestic workers' bills of rights, and how far we've come on these around the country, Ai-jen.
Absolutely. So this pandemic has hit domestic workers incredibly hard because domestic workers came into the pandemic with a tremendous amount of insecurity. 82% of domestic workers didn't have a single paid sick day coming into this pandemic. And what we saw very early on in the first week of the shutdown was dramatic losses in jobs and income, so much so that in March, we were holding calls with domestic workers where they were showing us on their Zoom screens literally 1 cent left in their bank account, no ability to put food on their table for their children. And here we are 7 months into this pandemic. And when you have a situation where you had no job security, no access to a safety net, and much of the pandemic relief has not reached you, it is a very dire situation. It's a full-blown depression for domestic workers. We're vacillating now between 38 and 40% unemployment among domestic workers. And then you have the workers who continue to work through this crisis, like the White House, the house cleaners, who are providing an essential lifeline to some of the people who are most vulnerable to the virus itself, like older people, people with disabilities, people with chronic illnesses, bringing them food, bringing them medication, providing essential services that are necessary for daily living for these populations of people. And they're doing so without access to PPE, without health care, without hazard pay. So they're having to pay out of pocket for PPE and COVID testing. And the burden of safety in this time of an unprecedented pandemic is falling on their shoulders, on the shoulders of the people who have the least amount of power and resources to navigate it all.
What rights do workers have to demand that they be even able to wear protective gear in a situation where they're told not to? And what are employers' responsibilities?
Well, that's the challenge in this industry is, one, there's been a long history of systematic exclusion from basic rights and protections, including many health and safety protections, which is why an essential workers' bill of rights is so important, and so important that it include domestic workers. But also, when you are isolated in a workplace and you have no job security, And everything that you ask for, you put yourself at risk of losing your job and your livelihood at a time when you simply cannot afford it. So the vulnerability and insecurity there cannot be overstated. It is incredibly difficult right now.
Are the White House resident staff unionized?
I believe that they are government employees, which means that they should be represented by a government union, but I don't know for sure.
You yourself, Ai-jen-poo, lost your grandmother during the pandemic, though not of COVID. Can you talk about your experience of actually being able to see her and what that meant to you?
I mean, my heart goes out to so many people who've been separated from loved ones who are ill and dying. I was able to go and visit my grandmother, who passed away at 94 on Mother's Day of natural causes. And I was told by my family that if I wanted to say goodbye, that I needed to come even in the midst of the pandemic. And so I masked up and quarantined and went and saw her. And I was able to hold her hand every single day for 10 days in order to say goodbye and to begin the process of grieving. And I cannot imagine. It really meant the world to me to have somebody who cared for me, for my childhood, through my whole life, be able to hold her hand and say goodbye and tell her how much I loved her. And I just can't imagine what it's been like for the 215 now thousand families who have lost their granddaughters, their grandmothers, their sisters, their best friends, and to not be able to appropriately grieve in this time of incredible crisis. I just can't imagine when I think about what my family has been through.
Well, our condolences to you and your family. Finally, the idea that a second stimulus package has not been passed, the consequences of this on the most vulnerable. The National Domestic Workers Alliance provided funding to domestic worker organizations around the country. How ironic that at this point you have smaller organizations providing food and funding, and yet the most able to afford and the larger employers not doing this, what this means, and the pressure on groups like yours, and what it means for people not to get more money right now as so many tens of millions lose their jobs.
I mean, what we saw was really early on in the crisis, incredible devastation. I mean, you had people who were working paycheck to paycheck. So there was no money, no savings to stock up on groceries or supplies. The level of food insecurity and housing insecurity is just unfathomable. It's like nothing I ever could have imagined in my 25 years of doing this work. So our Coronavirus Care Fund has been providing emergency cash assistance to domestic workers in need because we knew that we couldn't wait for government to act. And 7 months later, government funding still hasn't reached the majority of domestic workers in this country. And what they're using the funds for is groceries, to pay cell phone bills so that their children can stay connected to online learning opportunities. Literally, the basic fundamental human needs of survival are at stake right now. And the impact on children and families is just devastating in this time. So the Senate, shame on the Senate for not moving on actual relief that can reach every American. Every family, including immigrant families, deserves relief and safety in this time because they will be a part of our recovery as a country. And so I call upon the Senate, I call upon the White House to move on relief so that we can start moving towards recovery in this time.
Ajahn-Pu, I want to thank you so much for being with us. And again, our condolences to your family on the loss of your grandmother. Ajahn is Senior Advisor to Care in Action, which is dedicated to fighting for dignity and fairness for the millions of domestic workers across the country, the 501c4 arm of the National Domestic Workers Alliance. As we continue to look at how President Trump's reckless actions have threatened the health of the domestic staff at the White House, we're joined by Charles Allen. His father, Eugene Allen, worked as a butler at the White House, serving 8 presidents, from Harry Truman to Ronald Reagan. Eugene Allen died in 2010, but his life story became the basis of Lee Daniels' film, The Butler.
Political, Mr. Gaines?
No, sir.
Good. We have no tolerance for politics at the White House.
I'm Cecil Gaines. I'm the new butler.
You hear nothing, you see nothing. You only serve.
You know he got that job himself. The White House called him. He didn't call the White House.
I want to hear all the stories.
I don't know how many stories you're going to hear because they done swore him to some kind of secret code. I'm so proud of you.
Dr. King.
What did your daddy do?
He's a butler.
Young brother, the black domestic played an important role in our history.
Everything you are and everything you have is because of that butler.
Part of the trailer to The Butler, based on the life story of Eugene Allen. That was Oprah Winfrey and Forrest Whitaker playing Eugene Allen and his wife. Their son, Charles Allen, joins us now. We welcome you to Democracy Now! It's great to have you with us, Charles.
Thank you for having me.
So, as you watched President Trump on the balcony, I mean, so much was going on social media as people started to talk about him as Benito Trumpolini. I think Politico said things don't end well when you start with a balcony speech. But Trump standing there, does a military salute, gives a thumbs up, then dramatically takes off his mask, turns around and walks into the White House. Talk about who works in the White House, Charles Allen.
Well, I was listening to the lady you had on earlier, and she was talking about the status of the White House workers. And the White House workers are government employees, but they're not civil servants for the most part. The resident staff are not civil, so they come under accepted service. And what that means is, like, anytime they want to tell you that they don't need your services anymore, then you might come to work and your stuff will be at the gate in a cardboard box. But it's made up primarily the butler staff, like during Dad's time, it was primarily made up of African-American workers. And I think this had been true since the Roosevelt administration. So the butlers, which I'm more familiar with than the maids, but was primarily African-Americans, and the maids also. And then the housemen, primarily African-American. And as my dad used to say, they were, the little people that made it possible for the big people to do what they did.
And so, again, if your father was working there today, and can you talk about how you think President Trump compares as an employer, though he doesn't employ them? Is that right? They are federal employees.
They are federal employees, and they go from administration to administration. A lot of the staff have been there. My father had been there over 30 years, and the Ficklin family, I think it had been a member of the Ficklin family at the White House for over 50 years. So a lot of these jobs are, I think it's like, let's say like being a gondola in Venice. That's passed down from father to son and to daughters and whatnot. It goes on down the line. Tremendous family lineage, on that job.
Many of the staff, the majority of the staff, are African-American, are Latinx workers. They are older. Of course, this is the very population that during this pandemic is the hardest hit, 2.5 to 3 times harder, end up hospitalized, end up dying. if you can talk about this and why the first family, their actions in the White House so matter, and maybe use some examples from history with your dad there from, amazingly, right after World War II, President Truman right through to President Reagan.
There, a lot of the relationships during my father's time, anyway. I can't really speak after 1986 so much, but the relationships between the Butlers and the presidents, the first families, a lot of times there's some very close bonds that developed. I mean, very close familial bonds, if you will. And I mean, these people, the Butlers, there are 6, 7 full-time Butlers, and they come in contact with the family every day. I mean, face-to-face meeting with them every day. So they, and they're very dedicated people. I mean, my father never, and I don't guess he was the exception, but my father never missed a day at work. I mean, he prided himself on that. So for 35 years, he got up and he went in there, he went on that job. And he was dedicated, and my father and the other employees as well are very dedicated to those first families, very dedicated. All of my father, they used to ask him, which was his favorite president. And he said that he liked them all. And he was telling the truth. I can vouch for him. He found something in each one of those presidents and their families that he liked. He felt like all of them brought something to the table.
I don't know if it was true, based on truth, the first time he walks into the Oval Office bringing coffee and tea. It is President Eisenhower, and I mean, he did first serve President Truman, but he is calling in the National Guard, the state troopers, to integrate Little Rock, Arkansas, the high school.
Right. My dad, and it's interesting that you bring that up because that's one of the things that he said about, I can relate to you, that he said about President Eisenhower. And he said, whatever President Eisenhower's feelings might have been deep down inside, he said in regard to that situation in Little Rock, he said he did his job. He did his job. And sometimes that's all that you want people to do. Just do your job. What does it say that as a president? What does it say down here that you're supposed to do? Then do that. Protect all of the people, all of the people. And I think he admired that very much about Mr. Eisenhower.
General Eisenhower, President Eisenhower got sick in the White House, right? He had a heart attack. In fact, it's the beginning of the 25th Amendment. He had written a letter to his vice president, who he excluded from decision-making when he was sick. He had a kind of team of few advisors around him, definitely not the vice president, Richard Nixon. But ultimately, when he got really sick, he wrote a letter to him to say, you will take over. But this led to the 25th Amendment. Did your father talk about President Eisenhower getting sick and what that meant in the White House?
Not really, because when President Eisenhower got sick, he wasn't in the White House. He was somewhere, I forgot exactly where he was, but he was somewhere enjoying a holiday, playing golf, and he was stricken. And I think by the time that he got back to the White House, he had more or less convalesced, and he was in pretty good shape. So I don't think he was around Mr. Eisenhower that much when he was bedridden. Let me put it that way.
So what rights did your father have and others? And do you speak with people today who have worked in the White House? For example, if the first family isn't careful, if you have President Trump, for example, outright lying about he is immune. They won't reveal that he has taken a test that makes him negative. And as he dramatically takes off his mask, what rights do the workers who so intimately serve a president have?
They've got all of the rights in the world, but you have to understand they have to be very careful. And one of the reasons they have to be especially careful is because they're accepted workers, which means that they can just say, well, we don't need your services here any longer. And so they have to be very careful. They have to keep stuff to themselves. I don't know.
And
they're the little people. They have to be very careful.
What do you think can be done?
Very dedicated people.
What do you think can be done to support and protect them more? As, for example, you have the reports in the New York Times that workers who get sick, and we're only learning about these one by one, that may be larger, for example, than 4 people right now in what's called the resident staff.
The residents, right.
When it said we won't be revealing who's there and how many are sick.
Right. You know, to tell you the truth, I really don't know. I really don't say, like right now, as we're speaking now, and the administration that we live under now, I don't know what could be done to protect them. I really don't.
Does it make you angry what you're seeing now in the White House?
I feel for them. Yes, I feel for them very much, because it's a very closed mouth. As everyone understands, it's a very closed-mouth group of people, and they don't come out, they don't talk about things. It's kind of like it was in the movie Butler, you know, where, they're sitting around playing cards, and I think it was Lenny Kravitz said somebody's been running his mouth and stuff. And very closed-mouth. They didn't talk a lot about stuff that went on in that job. They really did.
Well, Charles Allen...
Yes.
I want to thank you so much for being with us, son of the former White House butler Eugene Allen, whose story was the inspiration for the feature film of Lee Daniels called The Butler. Next up, as we mark Indigenous Peoples Day, we look at the ongoing Indigenous-led protests against President Trump's border wall in southern Arizona. Stay with us. Agorobera, Son Rompe Pera featuring Chico Trujillo. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The Quarantine Report. I'm Amy Goodman. 14 states and more than 130 cities across the United States are celebrating Indigenous Peoples Day today in place of, or in addition to, Columbus Day, as the myth of Columbus as beneficent discoverer is debunked. As he's talked about, an oppressive colonizer, the holiday comes amidst a growing call to remove monuments to Columbus, along with Confederate generals. It also offers a chance to recognize the critical role of Indigenous people in protecting the planet. So we spend the rest of the hour in Arizona looking at how O'odham land and water defenders are leading a campaign against the construction of the U.S.-Mexico border wall near a sacred spring inside the Organ Pipe National Monument. The federal government has blocked road access to the sacred spring, where contractors have been pumping millions of gallons of groundwater to make cement for the wall. In August, activists temporarily blocked access to a site where 30-foot steel barriers were being assembled for use in the wall.
No border, no wall. No border, no wall. No border, no wall. No border, no wall. No border, no wall. No border, no wall.
This campaign of nonviolent protests comes as a federal appeals court issued an order Friday to halt the border wall construction in Arizona, along with Texas, New Mexico, and California, in response to a lawsuit filed by the Sierra Club, along with multiple states and other groups. The Ninth U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals said the Trump administration violated the Constitution when it tried to pay for the construction using $3.6 billion that Congress had authorized for the military. For more, we go to Tucson, Arizona, where we're joined by Nellie Jo David, an Odom water and land defender who was arrested last month on, he has said, Odom traditional homeland when protesting near the construction site of the U.S.-Mexico border wall and Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. Nellie, welcome to Democracy Now! Can you explain what's happening there and the significance of this court decision?
Well, thank you, Amy. Yeah, it's been a pretty tumultuous road. Our lands have been under militarization by Border Patrol, by occupying entities pretty much my entire life, and so this is just another episode in which we have just been under complete militarization from these entities, and now it's including these companies that are putting in man camps where I'm from, Ajo, Arizona, and for them to be constructing during this time of COVID is especially troubling for us. We're dealing with our own problems on top of the fact that they're desecrating our sacred sites in the area of Quito Baquito Springs, in the area of Monument Hill, and then and beyond in many areas in Cabeza Prieta Wildlife Refuge and also the Berry Goldwater bombing range. So all of these areas of land are occupied and, are our ancestral indigenous territory. And so we've been engaged since wall construction started in August in trying to stop the border wall. And recently, it just came it came to a place where we could no longer watch this without doing something drastic. And in our case, we, stood in front of bulldozers, and, I ended up sitting in the bucket of a bulldozer and ended up getting arrested for that.
When was that?
That was about a month ago on September 9th.
Explain who the Tohono O'odham are, who you are, and the indigenous people who live in this area, and where the land stretches.
Yes, I would love to. So it's a pretty large landscape. The Tohono O'odham Reservation is roughly the shape of Connecticut, but that's not that doesn't confine the area where we're originally from. Originally, our traditional landscapes extends as far north to what's now known as the Gila River and Salt River reservations in the Scottsdale, Phoenix area, all the way west towards Yuma, and all the way south towards the Caborca area in Mexico, and all the way east to the San Pedro River, where I'm currently located in Tucson. So this is a pretty large landscape, and our people and our heritage doesn't really know borders. I mean, it doesn't know borders. We have O'odham in Mexico. I personally have family in Mexico, and so with these borders that are crossing our territorial homelands, it has impacted us in pretty much every way that it could impact us.
Can you talk about what happened when you were arrested? How were you treated?
Oh man, it was a very difficult experience. We were out there early in the morning. We had not intended to do what we did that day, but felt compelled to, given the desecration that was happening. And so we were out there in the heat for a good 2 hours, holding off the the construction from happening until they arrested us. And then once we were arrested, we were handcuffed and taken to Lukeville, where we were fingerprinted and processed. And from there, we didn't know what was going to happen to us. We thought we were going to be taken to Ajo, which was, local jail, about 45 minutes from Lukeville, which is at the port of entry. And so that's where we thought we were going. But they ended us taking us past Ajo for a few more hour drive. And we ended up going all the way to Florence facility, also known as a Core Civic. And so from there, it was a really confusing and scary moment for us, or 2 days, because we spent 2 days there. We were so from the moment we got there, we were kind of treated as if we were dangerous individuals. We were chained and handcuffed to our waist and around our feet. Reminded me of all the Operation Streamline proceedings that we witness here in Tucson. They happen every single day. So we were chained. We were not told what was happening. We asked for lawyers. We were not allowed to speak to one till the next day. We asked for phone calls. We were not given a phone call. It took a lot of time for them to actually process us. So from going to that extreme heat in the Arizona desert to the extreme cold of the Core Civic facility, we weren't feeling too great at that point. And it got to be pretty late into the night until we were actually processed. And
did they ask you your citizenship status, Nellie?
I don't remember. I don't think that they did. I think that they might have known that we were not we had citizenship on this side.
Mm-hmm. And can you talk about what this wall has meant and the effect on the environment as well? I mean, Democracy Now! Was out there covering this area. We saw and have since seen some of the destruction and what it means for ceremonies and for the environment.
Yeah, the destruction's been devastating. Since August, a year ago, or over a year ago, we've seen this violation, the Hashan, the saguaro cactus. In our autumn stories, we view them as people. And so to watch them be uprooted from their locations where they're at, and then just pretty much left there to die, many of them, the Border Patrol or construction or whoever's the entity, as a spokespeople, were claiming that they were not killing the saguaro cactus, but they were killing very many of them. We saw them just kind of carelessly thrown on the side, which they were later picked up. There was all kinds of wilderness that just had to be removed for just the access roads. There's a 30-foot access road. And so that all of that was killed and violated. And so that was one of the first violations. And then, we saw Monument Hill being blown up in a big show of might while the Tono Atom chairman was in Washington, D.C. And also, there's so many sites that have been impacted. It's a very large stretch of land. And then Quito Baquito Spring is the most recent one that's been desecrated. And it is a very vital source of water in the middle of a very dry desert. This is a corridor where prevention through deterrence is used to, target migrants that are coming through, because it is known by authorities that water is such a precious resource that folks coming through, if they don't have that water, animals coming through, all pretty much wildlife, if they don't have that water, that's that means the end of the life cycle. So that's what Quito Baquito Springs means to us. It's the source of life. It's the source of so much for people, for plants, for desert, fauna, and pretty much all life surrounding that. And so since the border wall construction began, drillers have come and pretty much set up all around the area and have been drilling groundwater for the roads, and as well in addition to mixing concrete to hold the steel barriers. And so pretty much all year we've been watching Quito Baquito Springs and how its water source has been depleted. The rate in which the flow comes from a mountain. It comes out of a mountain and into a man-built oasis where the water is kept. But it's a natural spring, and that natural flow has been very much impacted by all of that drilling. And in addition to these huge lights in the area, we have some of the most beautiful views of the stars around. And those bright lights are also affecting all of the animals. There's bird migrations. It's a very important animal and bird migratory habitat. And just last year, we saw many footprints from, what we know as Mexico coming into Quito Baquito Springs. And because there is a border wall barrier, all of these animals who are coming on foot, even animals or birds that have low flying power, cannot access the springs. And so we fear and we worry that the border wall will cause extinction for many of these animals, including the Sonoran pronghorn. If it loses its water source in the area, there's a Sonoran mud turtle, there's the Quito Baquito pupfish. And so there's all of this life that we're watching before our eyes as it's all harmed. And so it's been a very scary and very devastating thing for us. And it's also our heritage. We had ancestors that lived at the spring. Amber Ortega, who was arrested with me, is a direct descendant of people that lived, that lived at Quito Baquito Springs. And so surrounding the entire area, we had villages, we had all these connections. Sonoita is a nearby border community.
Nellie Jo David, as we come to the end of this discussion on this Indigenous Peoples Day, can you talk about the solidarity across Indigenous communities in the borderlands against the wall, including the Kumeyaay people of California?
Yes, we are in solidarity of Kumeyaay and Carrizo Comecrudo, Lipan Apache, and all border Indigenous peoples whose lives have been so severely impacted by not only this border wall, but the complete militarization of our homelands due to this irrational fear of folks on the other side, which are our relatives. And so other tribes, other Indigenous people along the border feel that pain of being disconnected, of having a border cross us. And so, we definitely stand in solidarity. Many of us who have been taking actions against the construction have gone to other places, such as the Carrizo Comecrudo area in Texas, and also the Kumeyaay lands that and now occupied California.
And will this ruling stop the building of the wall, with federal courts saying no to diverting military funds into the southern border wall?
Well, I certainly hope so, and it should. I'm very skeptical of things like that. Last June,
we have 20 seconds.
Okay. Well, last year we were told that that we had time, and then the Supreme Court issued a stay, and it was lifted, and we no longer have that. So I hope so. But in the meantime, actions are still going to take place in which we will fight the border wall, we will fight militarization, we will fight the desecration of our homelands.
Nellie Jo David, I thank you so much for being with us. Tona Odom, water and land defender, part of the ongoing nonviolent protests against the construction of the U.S.-Mexico border wall and the Oregon Pipe Cactus National Monument. That does it for our broadcast. I'm Amy Goodman. Stay safe. Wear a mask.